It was one of those rare moments when history stops advancing gradually and instead teeters on the edge of absolute collapse. There were no visible explosions in major cities, no armies crossing continents to applause or despair, no officially declared war, and yet in October 1962, the world stood closer to annihilation than ever before. It was the height of the Cold War, a conflict waged not only with weapons, but with influence, fear, ideology, and above all, nuclear deterrence. Two superpowers had spent years building arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over, not to use them, but to ensure they never would have to. The balance was perverse, almost paradoxical. Peace depended on the certainty of mutual destruction. And at that specific moment, that balance began to fail. At the center of this tension were two men who quite literally held the fate of the world in their hands. On one side, John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, elected with the promise of confronting the spread of communism without dragging the planet into war. On the other, Nikita Khrushchev, an experienced leader shaped by the scars of World War II, determined to prove that the Soviet Union could rival and even surpass American power. Neither man wanted war, but both knew that backing down could signal weakness, and weakness, in that game, was an invitation to disaster. Between them, like a forward piece on a global chessboard, stood Cuba, an island that, until a few years earlier, had orbited American influence, but had now become both a symbol of resistance and an unprecedented strategic risk. The rise of Fidel Castro to power in 1959 was not merely a change of government, it was a geopolitical rupture. For Washington, Cuba had always been more than a neighbor. It was an extension of its sphere of influence, a security zone virtually guaranteed since the 19th century. The idea of a nation aligned with the Soviet Union, less than 150 kilometers from Florida, was, for many American strategists, simply unacceptable. But for Castro, alignment with Moscow was not purely ideological. It was a matter of survival. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, backed by the United States, it became clear that his government was under constant threat. The Soviet Union offered protection, economic support, and most importantly, a shield against further attempts to overthrow him. For Khrushchev, Cuba represented a unique opportunity. For years, the United States had surrounded the Soviet Union with military bases and nuclear weapons positioned in allied countries. American missiles in Turkey and Italy could reach Soviet territory within minutes. The strategic balance, therefore, was deeply unequal. By placing nuclear weapons in Cuba, Khrushchev could invert that logic almost overnight. For the first time, American cities like Washington, New York, and even critical military bases would be within immediate range of a Soviet nuclear strike. It was not merely about defense, it was a power move, an attempt to redefine the global balance. Even so, the decision was not simple. Within the Soviet leadership itself, there was resistance. Many saw the plan as excessively risky, a direct provocation that could trigger exactly the kind of war both sides were trying to avoid. Khrushchev, however, believed that the element of surprise would change everything. If the missiles were installed in secret and revealed only once operational, the United States would be confronted with a fait accompli. In that scenario, Kennedy would have few real options: accept the new reality or initiate a war that could quickly spiral out of control. It was a high-stakes gamble based on the assumption that the opponent would choose to avoid the worst-case scenario. The plan required precision and, above all, absolute secrecy. Soviet ships began crossing the Atlantic carrying not only military equipment, but also nuclear warheads, launchers, and thousands of soldiers disguised as civilian technicians and engineers. In Cuba, construction was carried out with extreme caution. During the day, equipment was hidden under camouflage nets. At night, teams worked relentlessly to assemble launch platforms. Each passing day brought the missiles closer to operational readiness. and with it, the moment when the Soviet Union could reveal its move. But while Moscow relied on secrecy, Washington was beginning to suspect. The American intelligence community, accustomed to operating in the shadows, started to piece together fragments of information that, individually, seemed insignificant, but together formed an alarming picture. Reports from field agents pointed to unusual movements of Soviet equipment on Cuban soil. Local informants spoke of the constant arrival of specialists who did not behave like ordinary civilians. Scattered photographs, fragmented reports, logistical patterns out of the ordinary, everything pointed to something bigger, something not yet provable, but increasingly real. The problem was that suspicion was not enough. In such a delicate scenario, any action based on incomplete information could be catastrophic. Concrete proof was needed, something irrefutable that could justify a response, whether diplomatic or military. And it was this necessity that led to the decision to intensify aerial reconnaissance missions over Cuba, using one of the most advanced tools of the time, U-2 spy planes, capable of flying at extreme altitudes and capturing detailed images of ground installations. On October 14, 1962, one of those missions changed the course of history. The pilot flew over the island undetected, capturing thousands of photographs of suspicious areas. At first glance, they were merely images of terrain, structures, and equipment. But when analyzed by specialists, they revealed something far more significant. The identified structures followed known patterns of Soviet nuclear missile launch sites. It was no longer a hypothesis, no longer an abstract fear. It was confirmation. At that moment, what had once been a distant possibility became the greatest threat ever faced by the United States, and by extension, the world. Because it was not just about missiles on a distant island, it was about time, response time, the margin for error that had nearly vanished. With nuclear weapons just minutes away from major American cities, any wrong decision, any communication failure, any impulsive reaction could trigger a chain of events impossible to contain. And perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all was that, at that very moment, most people around the world continued living their lives as usual. They worked, studied, made plans for the future, completely unaware that this future was silently at risk. Because the decisions that would determine the fate of humanity were not being made in the streets or on battlefields, but behind closed doors, among a small group of men carrying a weight impossible to measure. The crisis had not yet erupted. No shots had been fired. No public ultimatums had been issued. But the machinery was already in motion. And once set in motion, it might no longer be possible to stop it. The confirmation changed everything, and yet, at the same time, it changed nothing. Because while inside the White House, reality had been irreversibly transformed, outside the world kept turning with an almost absurd sense of normalcy. In Washington, D.C., cars still moved along the avenues, cafes still served their tables, and newspapers still carried headlines that, while important, were nowhere near reflecting the true gravity of what had just been discovered. Inside a restricted room, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. There, every word was measured, every silence carried weight, and every possible decision seemed to lead, one way or another, to the same destination: war. The photographs captured by the U-2 were spread across the table, analyzed repeatedly by specialists and strategists. There was no longer any doubt. The identified structures didn't just resemble known Soviet installations. In every meaningful way, they were identical. Launch platforms, storage areas, logistical patterns. Everything indicated that the missiles were not only present, but already in an advanced stage of installation. From that moment on, time became the most critical factor of all. Estimates suggested that in just over a week, those weapons would be fully operational. And when that happened, any attempt to remove them would require immediate action or a silent acceptance of a new strategic reality. President John F. Kennedy knew he couldn't afford to react impulsively. The recent memory of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion still loomed over his administration as a constant reminder that rushed decisions could have devastating consequences, not just militarily, but politically. And now the stakes were incomparably higher. This wasn't about a regional mistake. It was about a potential nuclear conflict between superpowers. That was when Kennedy gathered a select group of advisors, a committee that would come to be known as XCOM. Present were military leaders, diplomats, strategists, and key figures of the government, all tasked with answering a single question: what now? But the question, simple in form, concealed brutal complexity, because every option carried not only immediate risks, but cascading consequences that could spiral completely out of control. The first option, strongly advocated by parts of the military leadership, was direct and brutal. A massive airstrike against the missile bases in Cuba, followed, if necessary, by a full invasion of the island. Among its strongest proponents was Curtis LeMay, a man whose experience in World War II had shaped a clear and aggressive view of military power. To him, the logic was simple. The threat existed, it was real, and it had to be eliminated before it became irreversible. Any hesitation, in his view, would only increase the risk. But that apparent simplicity concealed a fundamental problem. A direct strike wouldn't just be a military action. It would in practice be an act of war against the Soviet Union. And there was no guarantee that the Soviet response would be limited to Cuba. On the contrary, many in the room believed the most likely response would occur in Europe, especially in one of the most sensitive flashpoints of the Cold War, Berlin. The city, divided and surrounded by Soviet bloc forces, was a powder keg waiting to explode. A strike in Cuba could be answered with a strike in Berlin, and from there, escalation could become inevitable. The second option was the diplomatic path. Direct negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev, seeking a solution that would avoid open confrontation. But this approach had its own risks. Negotiating under threat could be seen as weakness. Accepting the presence of the missiles, even temporarily, could permanently alter the strategic balance. And there was also the issue of time. Diplomacy was slow, and the missiles were being assembled at that very moment. The third option, a kind of middle ground between action and restraint, was the implementation of a naval blockade, or as Kennedy carefully preferred to call it, a quarantine. The difference wasn't just semantic. A blockade, technically, was considered an act of war. A quarantine, on the other hand, could be framed as a defensive measure. The idea was simple: prevent more military equipment from reaching Cuba, putting pressure on the Soviet Union without launching a direct attack. But even this option was far from safe, because it depended on something impossible to fully control: the Soviet response. If Soviet ships refused to stop, what would happen? Would the United States be prepared to fire on Soviet vessels in open waters? And if that happened, how long would it take before the situation spiraled completely out of control? As these discussions unfolded, a quiet element began to seep into the decision-making process: fear. Not irrational fear, but calculated, constant, present in every argument, every pause, every exchanged glance in that room. Because for the first time, the possibility of nuclear war was no longer a strategic abstraction. It was a real consequence of decisions that had to be made within days. And this is exactly where you need to pause for a second and think. Because all of this was happening while most people had no idea what was at stake. As these decisions were being debated, millions of people continued their routines, completely unaware that the world could change, or simply end, because of choices made by a handful of individuals in a closed room. If you've made it this far, you've already realized this isn't just a story about politics or war. It's about human decision-making under extreme pressure. So stay with it, because from here on, the tension only escalates, and the next moments are, without exaggeration, the most dangerous in modern history. Back in the meeting room, the pressure only intensified. Kennedy listened, questioned, weighed every angle. Unlike some of his advisors, he wasn't just looking for an effective solution. He was searching for one that would avoid the worst possible outcome. And that required something extremely difficult, resisting the urge to act immediately. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev was still operating under the assumption that the United States had not discovered the missiles. Construction continued at an accelerated pace. Each passing day brought the moment closer when the Soviet strategy would become irreversible. And ironically, the closer that moment came, the more dangerous the situation became, because it drastically reduced the options available to both sides. Back in the United States, decisions began to take shape in concrete actions, even if invisible to the public. The U.S. Navy initiated strategic movements in the Atlantic. Submarines began tracking Soviet vessels. Armed forces moved to a heightened state of alert. There were no official announcements, no alarming public statements, but the American military machine was quietly preparing for a possible conflict. At the same time, the government made a deliberate effort to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Political speeches continued, public schedules were kept, and no clear sign of the crisis was revealed. It was an attempt to buy time. Time to plan, time to position forces, time to decide. But in that scenario, time was not a reliable ally, because with every passing hour, the missiles in Cuba moved closer to operational readiness. And with that, the window for a solution that didn't involve war began to slowly close. The tension wasn't just growing, it was compressing. Like a spring being pushed beyond its limit, ready to snap at any moment. And no one, on either side, could say with certainty what would happen when it finally did. Because in the end, this wasn't just a dispute between two nations. It was a test of the limits of human rationality in the face of its own possible end. And the worst was yet to come. When the crisis finally surfaced, it did not arrive as an immediate explosion, but as a controlled revelation, cold, calculated, and impossible to ignore. On the night of October 22, 1962, millions of people around the world stopped to listen to the address by John F. Kennedy. Until that moment, most still did not understand what was truly at stake. Within minutes, that changed. Kennedy spoke directly, without unnecessary dramatization, but with a gravity that carried through every word. He confirmed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, describing them not as an abstract threat, but as weapons capable of striking American cities within minutes. There was no more room for doubt, nor for optimistic interpretation. The crisis was now public, and with that, it became global. But the speech was not only a revelation, it was also a warning. Kennedy announced the implementation of a naval quarantine, making it clear that any attempt to deliver further weapons to Cuba would be intercepted. More than that, he established a clear red line. Any nuclear attack launched from Cuba would be considered a direct attack by the Soviet Union against the United States, requiring a full response. It was, in effect, a direct message to Nikita Khrushchev, one that left no room for misinterpretation. On the other side of the world, Khrushchev listened. And contrary to what many might expect, his initial reaction was not one of immediate defiance, but of cautious relief. He had seriously considered the possibility of a surprise American strike. The fact that Kennedy had chosen a quarantine indicated that there was still room for negotiation. There was still time, limited, but enough to avoid the worst-case scenario. While leaders evaluated their options, at sea the situation was evolving into something far more dangerous. The U.S. Navy was already in position, forming a ring around Cuba. Soviet ships were advancing toward the quarantine line, carrying supplies and potentially more military equipment. The orders were clear, yet filled with ambiguity. Intercept, warn, stop, and if necessary, use force. It was there, in that seemingly empty expanse of ocean, that the fate of the world could be decided, Not in major capitals, not in conference rooms, but among captains, radar operators and crews who had seconds, sometimes less, to make decisions that could rapidly escalate into something irreversible. On October 24th, the critical moment arrived. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American radar tracked them closely. Communications were tense, measured, loaded with meaning. And then, at the last possible moment, something unexpected happened. The Soviet ships slowed down. Some changed course, others simply stopped. There were no shots fired, no direct confrontation. But the impact of that moment was immense. It was the first concrete sign that escalation could be halted, that perhaps there was still a path away from collapse. But the crisis was far from over. In the days that followed, tensions reached even more dangerous levels. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was killed. Inside the White House, many saw this as the beginning of open hostilities. Pressure for an immediate military response increased dramatically. It was exactly the kind of incident that could trigger a chain reaction. At the same time, messages began arriving from Moscow. The first, sent by Khrushchev, had an almost personal, emotional tone. He spoke about avoiding war, about responsibility, about the weight of decisions that could destroy everything. The second message, sent shortly after, was harsher, more strategic, demanding clear concessions, including the removal of American missiles from Turkey. Within the U.S. government, the dilemma intensified. Which message should be answered? Which one represented the true Soviet position? And more importantly, how much time was left? The final decision required something beyond strategy. It required human judgment. Kennedy chose to respond to the first message, ignoring the second. At the same time, through non-public channels, he signaled that the United States would be willing to remove its missiles from Turkey. It was a delicate move, almost invisible, but decisive. And then on October 28, 1962, the response came. Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile bases in Cuba and remove the nuclear weapons from the island. In return, the United States would commit not to invade Cuba and quietly would remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. Not with a clear victory for either side, not with celebration, but with a deep and almost silent sense of relief. The world had reached the edge of the abyss and stepped back at the last possible moment. But perhaps the most important part of this story is not what happened, but what could have happened. Because at several points during those days, all it would have taken was a different decision, a misinterpretation, a technical error, or an emotional impulse, and the outcome would have been entirely different. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a confrontation between superpowers. It was an extreme test of the limits of human reason under absolute pressure. A reminder that even at the height of tension, careful decisions can still prevent the worst. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this episode so unsettling. Because it proves that the world can come dangerously close to its end, and that sometimes all that separates survival from catastrophe are decisions made by a few, in silence, under a pressure that almost no one can truly comprehend.